But I thank you very much. Last year when I spoke to you, we were preparing for an election. And Gordon Brown was enjoying a political honeymoon. And since then, he's gone from Mr. Boom to Mr. Bust in record time. And his claim to have delivered prosperity and economic stability is dissolving by the day in the acid bath of recession. Now, custom dictates that I should make a few jokes at his expense. But I think I've already done enough of that, and I'm not a sadist. I've no wish to kick a twitching corpse. I want to turn my attention instead to those plausible, oleaginous, well-bred salesmen who are marketing a new brand of snake oil, the Cameron Conservatives. Now, to me, they resemble one of those rather phony American religious cults. You know, unlike the nasty old Tories, the latter-day New Conservatives are warm and welcoming. And any references to frightening Old Testament prophets like Mrs. Thatcher and Norman Tebbit have been deleted from the scriptures. And instead they preach the gospel of St. Anthony. That's St. Anthony Blair, their spiritual inspiration. Now, the door to Cameron's heaven is wide open, unless that is you're overweight or from the north of England. The rich are especially welcome, and the need to pass through the eye of a needle has been waived, providing, of course, that large cheques are made out to the latter-day New Conservatives. The Book of Zechariah, sometimes referred to as Goldsmith, explains the new creed, which is that truly blessed are the super rich. And this helps to explain their growing missionary activity overseas, with flourishing branches in Europe, in Monaco and Liechtenstein, and even in the third world, in Belize. Now, there will be miracles. And Mr. Osborne, who, like Mr. Cameron, is a graduate of Oxford University's Bullingdon Theological College, he will perform the miracle of the loaves and fishes on the public finances. The sick will be healed without additional health funding. Water will be turned into cheap petrol. And they now promise us the ultimate Tory miracle, Tory fairness. Now, there are people around who believe that North Korea is a democracy. And there are people who believe that the BNP promotes racial equality. And there are even people who believe that pigs can fly. But even people who believe that pigs can fly will struggle to get their heads around the idea that the Tories are the party of fairness. Let's just briefly have a look at their new tax policy, which is to share the proceeds of recession. If there are any proceeds to share, their top priority is to lift millionaires, indeed double millionaires, out of inheritance tax. Their second priority is to remove the burden of stamp duty from share dealers. The Cameron Conservatives want a marriage-based tax system which will punish widows and women escaping from domestic violence through divorce because they're no longer married. That's what the Tories mean by fair taxation. But in the competition for converts, it isn't just Brown's Labour Party which will be under pressure. We're also going to be faced with an onslaught of the Conservatives' vacuous friendliness and all-embracing emptiness. And we therefore have to offer a more deeply rooted, more principled alternative, a clearer analysis of why Britain faces a growing crisis, and a more honest statement of what the government can and cannot do. The starting point is that we're in the middle of a major financial earthquake. This time last year, we had the collapse of Northern Rock. This morning, we've had the collapse of one of the world's leading investment banks, Lehman Brothers. Now, some people say this is the curse of the Liberal Democrats. But more seriously, there is clearly a crisis of far-reaching proportions. Now, our government didn't cause this crisis. Its biggest folly was hubris, this delusional claim to have abolished the boom and bust cycles to which all capitalist economies are prone. They forgot that financial success breeds excess, that unearned rewards feed greed, and that overconfidence leads to folly. This new Labour government incubated a culture of financial gambling with other people's money, which has contributed to the collapse of trust in financial institutions. And it also bred a dangerous dependence on debt. Now, you'll have heard me every year warning that British families were acquiring unsustainable levels of debt. And most of this debt was secured against the illusory wealth of vastly inflated property prices. People were encouraged to believe they would rise forever and ever. And those who warned of the dangers were initially treated as eccentrics, and then as scaremongers and prophets of doom. But we were right. And we now see the inevitable consequences of a bursting market bubble. Many houses can't be sold, the house building industry is collapsing, banks' balance sheets are drenched in red ink, millions of families face negative equity, those who can't service their mortgages face the threat of repossession, and many families are worried, and some are scared. Now, we've got the credibility which goes with having warned of the dangers, and we've got to use that credibility to spell out honestly what can and cannot be done. The government must not try to prop up house prices, which have to fall back to a sensible level which makes housing affordable for ordinary families. The government must not compromise the independence of the Bank of England by telling it to slash interest rates and generate another dangerous inflationary bubble. It must not underwrite new mortgage lending by the banks because it's simply not acceptable to socialise losses and privatise profits. Indeed, those overpaid financiers who are now rattling their bagging bowls and demanding help from the taxpayer should be sent packing. There are, however, some sensible practical things which can and should be done. Social landlords should have more freedom to acquire surplus property and land. And that will help them provide homes for those in need on housing waiting lists. Lenders must be stopped from pushing thousands of families into homelessness through repossession. There has to be effective regulation to stop a repetition of the binge of irresponsible lending. And more fundamentally, we have to confront our national obsession with property, because houses are homes to live in. They're not gambling chips. Britain has also experienced another price shock from oil. Now, living standards are rising in Asia rapidly, and that's something actually we should welcome. But demand is outstripping supply, and high prices are an advanced warning of the need to move rapidly to a post-oil economy. Now, people ask, since Britain's an oil producer, why can't we have cheap oil? But the reality is that our own production's falling rapidly because for over a century, a valuable resource has been squandered. It's interesting to see, by contrast, what's happening across the North Sea in Norway. Now, they could easily afford the cheapest petrol in Europe, but in reality, they've chosen to have the most expensive petrol in Europe. Now, why, you might ask, are Norwegian road hauliers and motorists not rioting on the streets of Oslo? They aren't, because instead of the gimmicky populism espoused by our Conservatives and Scottish nationalists, their political leaders say that resource conservation and the environment must come first. They advocate green taxes on oil. And Britain needs a political party with the courage and political maturity to spell out the same message. Now, there will be a great deal of pain in the coming recession. And what makes pain worse is the knowledge that it's unfairly distributed. I mean, it isn't possible to have a sense of society, let alone of patriotism, when hard-working families and pensioners pay through the nose while others don't pay their share and dodge taxes through tax havens or tax avoidance scams. Now, I keep reading in the press that some of our activists don't like the language of tax cutting and they think it's right-wing. But I don't see what's right-wing about wanting to cut the taxes of millions of people who earn less or barely more than the equivalent of the minimum wage. We know from the backlash against the loss of the 10p tax rate just how strongly low and middle income households feel about tax. Standard rate taxpayers currently pay 31 pence in every extra pound they earn on their income to the taxman. And that's on top of what's clawed back through wickedly overcomplicated, means-tested benefits and tax credits. Now, any rational person faced with this wall of disincentives will ask, why should I bother to work? Why should I bother to save? And we have an opportunity, more than an opportunity, we have a duty to confront this problem head-on and to become a tax-cutting party. And that's why Nick Clegg is absolutely right to have made this issue the central focus of debate for our party. Now, tax cuts, of course, cannot just be conjured out of thin air. We say that tax cuts should mostly be paid for by those who currently don't pay their fair share. How can it be right, for example, that the rate of tax on capital gains on second homes is less than half what it was under Nigel Lawson and Mrs. Thatcher, or half that on earned income? How can it be right that people with £1 million pension pots don't just have more tax relief, but a higher rate of tax relief on all their contributions? And how can it be right that failed executives, paid massive sums in golden goodbyes, can claim the first £30,000 tax-free? This must stop. So we must declare war on the antisocial practices of rich individuals and companies who avoid tax. And that means we've got to target tax havens in our dependent territory. And I was brought up to feel proud of those atlases covered with the red of the British Empire. But it's now a source of shame that the last few bits of British rock have been turned over to tax dodgers from the Channel Islands to the Cayman and Virgin Islands. I think British hard-pressed taxpayers might well ask, for example, why our country's biggest retailer, Tesco, should be packing up billions of pounds of British property in the Cayman Islands to avoid stamp duty. Now, some of you might say, and you will say this afternoon, that if you can raise more tax from the well-off and tax dodgers, why not spend it all on public services rather than cutting taxes? And I'm often told that in Sweden and Denmark, people are happy to see half of the country's GDP raised in tax and publicly spent. But there is a difference. These are highly decentralized democracies which raise far more tax, including income tax, and make big spending decisions locally. There is real democratic accountability. Now, we've got to commit ourselves to working towards those structures in Britain, decentralizing from central to local government. But in the meantime, we have a public sector which is all too often bloated, over-centralized, incompetent, and unaccountable. Now, I believe that there are areas where more public money could usefully be spent, on schools and further and adult education and mental health and law and order and the state pension. And despite being a tight-fisted Treasury spokesman, I support selective increases in public spending. But we also need to challenge in a fundamental way many of the things which government spends money on. We've already spoken out against industrial subsidies and payments to big farmers, the unnecessary child trust fund, and the means-tested tax credit, which extend into the upper income range, the ID cards, the superfluous and extravagant defence contracts designed mainly to fill the order books of the defence contractors, and widening further the bottomless pit of the nuclear power industry. We've got to stop the gravy train of management consultancy in government. We've got to stop questionable government IT projects like that for the NHS and insist that procurement is from the cheapest open source, and take an axe to the overgrown thickets of Quangoland. Now, the coward's way of dealing with public spending is to sack or squeeze the pay of low-paid public sector workers. The correct way is to start at the top. I mean, I would require every non-frontline public sector employee on £100,000 or more to reapply for their jobs. And those allowed back would take a cut in pay and public sector pension entitlement. And politicians, us, we can't lead a crusade against self-serving public sector extravagance unless we lead from the front. So MPs and ministers have got to accept deep cuts in their numbers and fringe benefits like pensions. The central message is that government should do fewer things well rather than many things badly. And that will help us to generate the resources to deliver Nick Clegg's pledge to hand money back to ordinary people. Now, in conclusion, I don't believe that economic policy is simply a matter of pulling policy levers and making numbers add up. It has to be rooted in a sense of values and a very clear narrative about the kind of society we want to see. I think there is a new mood. It's a mood of austerity. It's a reaction against greed and excess and waste and tax cheating and selfish, self-indulgent behaviour. It's an intolerance of binge lending by banks and binge spending by government. It's a craving for economic and personal security and sobriety and discipline, a demand that there is respect for fellow citizens and for the natural environment. And no other political party has yet found the language or the policies for this new world. But we have, and this is our opportunity. There is only one party that has a clear, sound, sensible and fair path through this economic crisis. And it's our party, the Liberal Democrats. Thank you.